As Ken told you, I've been working on pragmatist political economy for a long time. Larry Hickman will remember my giving a first paper on this in Poland many years ago when we were over there in a remote little mountain village talking with folks who had been through incredibly hard times and who opened their hearts and their doors to talking with us. And we just tried not to be hopelessly irrelevant, or worse yet, imperialistic in our sort of suggestion that we knew what their situation was and could come up with a little cookbook recipe, to use Dewey talk, to fix all their ailments. And so this project is one that I've been involved with for a long time. I know so many of you from conferences in which I've listened to and learned from you, and at the same time, of course, folks whose projects are well underway now who will do more than I will ever do to actually make this real. So I offer my contribution today as part of that continuing dialogue in the hope that it will help you advance this larger shared project in ways that will exceed the limitations of my own heart and mind, and perhaps, of course, lifetime as well. So let me start by shocking the socks off Ken Stickers by talking about his most recent public lecture. In his recent presidential address to the Society for the Advancement of American Philosophy, Kenneth W. Stickers argued that all of us who are racially privileged members of American society today are racists. Whether or not we intend to discriminate against or to exclude our racially differing neighbors, or even think of ourselves as white. This is so, Professor Stickers argued, because racial hierarchies, locations, limits, checkpoints, benefits, and costs are built into our historically grounded social system. Our laws, our economy, and our processes of accumulating and transmitting social capital through institutions like higher education that achieve these outcomes, which are registered deeply in our personal and social identities, the language and memories we categorize as myself in our individual streams of experience, the opportunities or lack thereof that lie behind those developed capabilities and associated character traits we and others now think of as distinctive to our personalities. Even the recognizable body selves we are, reflecting as they do the level of quality in our ongoing access to nutrition, clean air, clean water, health care, adequate rest, structured exercise, and security from violence, as this has activated certain potentials in our DNA and not others. We who are racially privileged benefit from this color-linked social system, whether we intend to or not, Professor Stickers argued, just as our African American, Native American, and Hispanic American neighbors experience undeserved and unequal obstacles to their freedom to live securely, to develop their bodies and their capabilities, and to deploy these effectively and as autonomously as is possible for beings like us in our efforts to frame meaningful future influencing lives. The radically unequal racial record of America's national economy since World War II in growing familial wealth is just one measure of the inequalities, exclusions from opportunities, and targeted harms to non-white people that our racialized social system continues to generate. But it is a better measure, Stickers argues, than is the presence of people of color now at all levels and kinds of institutions in America's once segregated higher education system, in its corporate boardrooms, and in its highest paid ranks of professional athletes and performing artists, because it reflects a continuing history of de facto exclusion, denial of opportunity, and vulnerability to life's exigencies that most people of color experience in comparison with the increasing practical empowerment into middle-class status of white people like my parents, whose parents were poor, uneducated, and unconnected to social networks of power when World War II began. There are many ways to think about justice in a democracy: equal treatment under law, real freedom in shaping one's life within the constraints of social living, meaningful participation in the ongoing framing of public policies and in the processes of redesigning institutions to meet changing social needs, respect, recognition, and practical support from one's neighbors in meeting one's human needs, social rewards commensurate with one's contributions and punishments commensurate with the harms to others one does, reliable institutions and practices that effectively assist individuals, families, and communities in fulfilling their best potentials. But none of these framings of the meaning of justice are satisfied by or can be satisfied within a racialized social system that such compelling evidence shows America still is. The only way white people can escape racism in America, as Stickers persuasively argues, is to change our racialized social system into what Martin Luther King Jr., like Jane Addams and John Dewey, called a social democracy. And the only way to effectively theorize and practically achieve that transformation is through the ongoing deployment of a pragmatist approach to political economy that combines institutionalized changes in law, politics, economy, education, religion, and other social structures with complementary changes in personal habits, social networks, and shared guiding ideals and felt patterns of meaning in social living. Professor Sticker's presidential address concluded without offering advice about how we can steer American society into this pragmatist turn toward real social democracy, although I know he is working hard on this crucial question. My purpose here today is to suggest that we can gain some important insights about these matters, including the hardest parts about how and why to change the American economy in ways that make for justice and peaceful, sustainable living for all, by reflecting again on the life and writings of Martin Luther King Jr., which I regret to say still seem insightful today, about America's racialized social system and what we must do to transform it from a system that generates increasing chaos into one that generates community. Many interpreters of Martin Luther King Jr.'s public legacy have suggested that his initial liberatory focus in the struggle for racial equality in America was limited to democratic political rights, and that he only later expanded his concerns to include economic justice and peace. However, a close reading of King's essays, speeches, sermons, and books shows that this reading is mistaken, and that his public focus from the beginning was on how to transform America's racialized political economy into a deep democracy. In this transformative process, King argued, nonviolence is a necessary characteristic of any feasible and desirable transformative means, even though many of his contemporaries argued, as some of ours do now, that disciplined self-defense and even strategic uses of violence must be alternative tools in the toolkit of democratic activists for justice who face violent, intransigent, and powerful opponents. King always regarded the struggles for economic justice and peace as inextricably intertwined within the larger social meaning of democracy, and he said so in public and in private from the beginning of the Montgomery bus boycott in 1956 throughout the years of his collaborative leadership of the modern American civil rights movement until his death in 1968. In fact, as King wrote in 1960, he learned a complex lesson during his years of growing up in segregated Atlanta. Quote, "The inseparable twin of racial injustice is economic injustice," end quote. And segregation led to the exploitation of blacks and of poor whites. When he accepted the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964, King expressed this complex lesson again, first conjoining in negative terms the fire hoses trained on protesting children in Birmingham, Alabama, the murder of college students seeking to register black citizens to vote in Philadelphia, Mississippi, and, quote, the debilitating and grinding poverty that afflicts my people and chains them to the lowest rung of the economic ladder, end quote. And then arguing in positive terms that African Americans and the poor people of India have shown, and South African civil rights leaders were then showing, that nonviolence is, quote, a powerful moral force which makes for social transformation, end quote, and that, quote, sooner or later, all the people of the world will have to discover a way to live together in peace, end quote. King invoked the same complex lesson in 1966, stating the positive goal of the civil rights movement continuing struggle and distinguishing the two kinds of changes it would require. Quote, our goal is to create a beloved community, and this will require a qualitative change in our souls as well as a quantitative change in our lives, end quote. Given this history, King's final plans for the racially integrated Poor People's March and summer-long demonstrations that came to pass only after his death, quote, they will have Negro and white participation, and they will seek to benefit the poor of both races, end quote, reflect the unity and complexity of King's lifelong vision, as did his comment that these necessary efforts to focus on the quantitative changes America needed were sure to be overshadowed by the Vietnam War, one of the many reasons why he believed that war must be brought to an end, and soon. In emphasizing these interconnections, and in his democratic faith that a better America would emerge from a sustained, well-organized process of nonviolent struggle, King's mid-20th century vision built on and further developed key ideas of a number of influential American pragmatist philosophers of the first half of the 20th century, including Jane Addams, William James, Josiah Royce, George Herbert Mead, and John Dewey, as well as those framed even more urgently by contemporaneous African American philosophers and transformative leaders, including Frederick Douglass, Booker T. Washington, Anna Julia Cooper, and W.E.B. Du Bois, who presciently announced in 1903 in The Souls of Black Folk that, quote, the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line, end quote, and urged a three-part strategy of, quote, work, culture, liberty, not singly, but together, end quote, as the path of struggle toward actualizing the full meaning of the overarching American ideal of social democracy. In a speech King delivered in 1962 in Nashville, Tennessee, entitled The Ethical Demands of Integration, he echoed, affirmed, and updated these earlier analyses of the American problem situation and of the democratic ideal that must guide multifaceted transformative action. And here's a long quote. The problem of race and color prejudice remains America's greatest moral dilemma. When one considers the impact it has upon our nation, internally and externally, its resolution might well determine our destiny. History has thrust upon our generation an indescribably important task to complete a process of democratization which our nation has too long developed too slowly, but which is our most powerful weapon for world respect and emulation. How we deal with this crucial situation will determine our moral health as individuals, as well as our cultural health as a southern region, our political health as a nation, and our prestige as a leader of the free world. The shape of the world today does not afford us the luxury of an anemic democracy. The price that America must pay for the continued oppression of the Negro is the price of its own destruction, end quote. Of course, whenever I quote King, I use King's language. King's three-part process for overcoming America's racial problem. First, transforming America's political economy, including its educational institutions. Second, influencing the formation of new habits that liberate the whole person. And third, please come in. Third, initiating active, ongoing high citizen participation in shaping better institutions and public policies reflects his complex philosophical activist legacy while advancing its goal, real integration into a fully functioning social democracy. The justice and love-centered religious faith and liberatory hope that energized and sustained King's personal transformative vision and motivation for lifelong struggle was closer to that of Hull House's founder, Jane Addams, than he may have realized. Just as his emphasis on, quote, the capacity to deliberate, decide, and respond, end quote, as the positive meaning of freedom, was closer to John Dewey's account than he acknowledged. King did note the importance of the ideas and efforts of Walter Rauschenbusch, Richard Rorty's grandfather, Henry George, and other progressive American religious thinkers and social visionaries as influences in the development of his own views. But he explained in 1960 that his earlier enthusiasm for, quote, so-called liberal democracy, end quote, liberal theology, end quote, had been chastened in light of still fresh experiences of human evil, such as the Nazi death camps and American race-based lynching, which gave weight to Reinhold Niebuhr's emphasis on sin as a barrier to progress. Yet any temptation to despair King felt from time to time was elevated by Martin Buber's illumination of the call of the other person to an I-thou relationship, as well as Paul Tillich's existentialist challenge to direct one's life energies toward the highest good one can imagine, which was similar in language and in spirit to Dewey's way of referring to God in a common faith. These three strands of inspiration, the philosophical, the activist, and the spiritual, converged in the life and work of Mohandas K. Gandhi, King's revered mentor in the method of nonviolent resistance to oppression through satyagraha, soul force, as the means to achieve social democracy. Gandhi's nonviolent liberatory struggle in India had achieved the birth of a fragile democracy that had already outlawed the caste system and begun experimenting with alternative economic models to uplift the poor when Martin and Coretta King accepted an invitation in 1959 to visit and learn from India's experience. Although King described himself philosophically as a personalist, emphasizing a specific understanding of personality as both ultimate reality and the greatest good, a view he shared with Gandhi and attributed to Jesus of Nazareth, I believe that recognizing King's debts to, affinities with, and major contributions to pragmatist political economy is both compatible with acknowledging this self-description and necessary to completing its scope in ways that give his still fruitful approach to social transformation its proper central place in the history of democratic theory and practice. By highlighting the pragmatist practical framework of King's personalism-guided theory of liberatory social and institutional transformation toward the conditions of deeper social democracy, economic justice, and positive peace, we can bring the complex unity of his vision into sharper focus and discern its continuing value as a 21st century guide to deeper democratic transformation. In these times of global turmoil, failures of formally democratic political systems to meet the needs of their people adequately and equally, the worst global recession since the Great Depression, and widespread war and terrorism, we can learn from King's pragmatist political economy that these issues arise and must be resolved together through well-organized, well-focused, mutually educative projects of nonviolent struggle that produce personal, social, and institutional changes that tend to expand and sustain the achievement of a better quality of lived experience for all individuals, communities, and nations. This may be the only way to transform the radical and growing economic, social, and political inequality between Black and white Americans, as well as rich and poor nations in our post-colonial global system, that Joe Fegan, Joseph Stiglitz, Jeffrey Sachs, Pope Francis, and even Barack Obama have raised alarms about in recent years. James Melvin Washington, who was commissioned by the King estate to edit A Testament of Social Hope, the essential writings and speeches of Martin Luther King Jr., suggested in his editor's introduction that King's words and actions reflect his own particular way of taking up his complex social, political, economic, and religious heritage and context as an African American living in the mid-20th century South. Like many African Americans, Washington wrote, King loved his country and his culture, but he was never a narrow nationalist of any kind, reserving his ultimate loyalty for a more ideal cosmopolitan world community guided by the practices of social democracy. Quote, "It is difficult to appreciate King's achievement if we do not understand that his dilemma was that he saw both the need for and the danger of nationalism. He certainly was an Americanist, but not a nationalist ideologue. He was faithful to his country so long as his country was faithful to the vision of what King often called the beloved community. Some Black leaders, such as Malcolm X. Shabazz, argued that King's vision was only a tragic fantasy. If so, that fantasy was shared by many children of African slaves and a nation of voluntary European immigrants," end quote. As King's professors at Boston University certainly knew, King's interpretation of America's painfully non-ideal current reality as a stage in its possible and longed-for development into the beloved community, for which committed activists in the civil rights movements he led served as living seeds, drew on the thinking of the great ideal pragmatist Josiah Royce, who argued for reframing narrower loyalties in terms of inclusive, other-affirming loyalty to loyalty. Like King, Washington wrote, many Black leaders correctly perceived that America is, quote, "a hermeneutical situation," end quote. This cadre includes Frederick Douglass, W.E.B. Du Bois, Langston Hughes, and James Baldwin, end quote. This is how Washington suggests King could both love and be sharply critical of America, because he considered it factually in relation to the normative ideals that most of its citizens still shared with its founders, even though interpreting the practical meaning of these ideals and achieving their actualization was and remains, at best, a dream, and at worst, in Shabazz's counterphrase, a nightmare. Washington affirmed that King's dream of such a better, actually possible America, a dream that, quote, "still excites our social and political imaginations," end quote, in Washington's words, always included economic justice and pluralistic social equality, as well as voting rights and other marks of democratic political inclusion, as the signs of shared positive freedom and the preconditions for civil and international peace. Quote, "He captured the spotlight of history precisely at the right time and responded with a blueprint," boy, that's an optimistic statement, "a blueprint for what America could become if it trusted its democratic legacy. It beckons us to work to realize the dream that America can be a truly pluralistic society and that planet Earth can be a place in the universe where peace, justice, and freedom are the dominant ethos." By calling his vision a dream, King reformulated a great hypothesis that the founders of this republic held dear and that the 20th century yearns to see made real in the 21st century. He believed, to use the words of James Baldwin in a recent open letter to Bishop Desmond Tutu, that, quote, Black freedom will make white freedom possible. Indeed, our freedom, which we have been forced to buy at so high a price, is the only hope of freedom that they have." End quote. Thus, King's vision, blueprint, or dream that his allies in the wider and longer human struggle shared and helped to shape was to be more fully actualized in the not-so-distant future that has become our 21st century now. This foreseeable future of social democracy, economic justice, and positive peace was the goal or end of their history-conscious efforts to frame their own time of struggle as a period of purposeful sacrifice that would eventually change the world. Quote, "I may not get there with you," King acknowledged to a church meeting of activists late on the evening before his death, "but we as a people will get to the promised land." End quote. How long, people must have asked him again and again. How long? Not long, King replied in more than one sermon. Yet King surely knew that completing and institutionalizing the changes he sought in the real America as the key to the better future for all humankind he and others sought would require many more years of struggle, and that the opposition would be intense, especially to the more democratic reframing of our economic institutions and the more equitable global redistribution of wealth, resources, and opportunities he called for. As King wrote in 1966, quote, "The hard, cold facts of racial life in the world today indicate that the hope of people of color in the world may rest on the American Negro and his ability to reform the structures of racist imperialism from within, and thereby turn the technology and wealth of the West to the task of liberating the world from want." End quote. As early as the 1956 Montgomery bus boycott, King's explanation of the goals of the American civil rights struggle always included economic redistribution to achieve democratic equitability and positive social peace. In that particular case, the movement's operative goals included not only courteous treatment by bus drivers and an end to the expectation that black passengers would give up their seats to white passengers, but also a hiring requirement that, quote, "Negro bus operators were to be employed on predominantly Negro routes," end quote. In Nonviolence and Racial Justice, an essay King published in 1957, shortly after the formation of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and his selection as its first president, he contrasted the true peace they sought with the merely negative peace that had been instituted and maintained by a long history of officially tolerated terroristic violence, judicially legalized exclusions, and customary inequality in wages and job opportunities prior to their recent nonviolent protests. The first step toward regaining and maintaining the self-respect that would be required for achieving a positive peace, King explained, was breaching this negative peace by demanding justice, using means that were compatible with that end. Quote, "Living under these conditions, many Negroes lost faith in themselves. They came to feel that perhaps they were less than human. So long as the Negro maintained the subservient attitude and accepted the place assigned to him, a sort of racial peace existed. But it was an uneasy peace in which the Negro was forced patiently to submit to insult, injustice, and exploitation. It was a negative peace. True peace is not merely the absence of some negative force, tension, confusion, or war. It is the presence of some positive force, justice, goodwill, and brotherhood." End quote. Attaining true peace requires achieving full freedom, King argued, practical means and capabilities, as well as civil liberty, because the pursuit of happiness requires the whole package, and those who have regained their self-respect will accept nothing less. Then current and continuing stirrings of discontent worldwide among peoples who still experience adverse effects of economically motivated colonialism are the first stage in the process of self-respect's emergence, King argued, which will lead them to struggle against those who strongly defend the old patterns of privilege until these social practices and institutions are justly transformed, and those who were once subordinated have attained the means and capabilities of full freedom. Quote, "The determination of Negro Americans to win freedom from every form of oppression springs from the same profound longing for freedom that motivates oppressed people all over the world. The dynamic beat of deep discontent in Africa and Asia is at bottom a quest for freedom and human dignity on the part of people who have long been victims of colonialism. The struggle for freedom on the part of oppressed people in general and of the American Negro in particular has developed slowly and is not going to end suddenly. Privileged groups rarely give up the privileges without strong resistance." You hear the echoes of Frederick Douglass, yeah. "But when oppressed people rise up against oppression, there is no stopping point short of full freedom. Realism compels us to admit that the struggle will continue until freedom is a reality for all the oppressed peoples of the world." End quote. Just as true peace requires full freedom, however, attaining full freedom requires that those who have been and still are oppressed pursue a sustainable peace with those who now oppress them, rather than simply a reversal of dominance or an equal share in roles of dominance and exploitation. Such a sustainable positive peace cannot be achieved through violence that seems to justify a violent response. Instead, King argues, it arises within a shared process of conscience-guided reflection, truth-telling, change in attitude, and subsequently changes in the institutional rules that determine distributions of opportunities and resources, leading to eventual reconciliation with one another and with the past. You notice reconciliation is eventual. Think of South Africa's process in this connection. King believed that this kind of change process toward shared full freedom and positive peace can be initiated by Gandhi's method of nonviolent resistance, as it already had been in India and in the American South. But he recognized that other oppressed people's willingness to use this method requires their belief that it eventually can be effective in their own situation. For some, the religious or spiritual faith that those who struggle for justice have what King called cosmic companionship may support the belief that, quote, "Even though the arc of the moral universe is long, it bends toward justice," end quote. For others, however, tangible evidence will be needed that nonviolent resistance can be more effective than violent struggle in achieving their ultimate goal, which itself may require adopting more realistic goals than wreaking a final revenge for the past or assuring total control of the future. "Time is running out," King said more than once, "because the human capacity to sustain hope for a better life is not infinite or endless, and despair leads to willful pursuit of chaos and deafness to what he called the sweeter sounds of peace." End quote. In King's view, the U.S. government's long-term failure to acknowledge the cruelty and injustice of chattel slavery and its continuing consequences, and to invest as needed in the quantitative aspects of the American dream of justice and equality, had fueled the impatience and despair that led to large-scale urban riots in the mid-1960s summers following the passage of the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, and the Equal Pay Act, as the American nation's attention turned toward the Vietnam War. Quote, long quote, "America is reaping the harvest of hate and shame planted through generations of educational denial, political disenfranchisement, and economic exploitation of its black population. Now, almost a century removed from slavery, we find the heritage of oppression and racism erupting in our cities, with volcanic lava of bitterness and frustration pouring down our avenues. Black Americans have been patient people, and perhaps they could continue patient with but a modicum of hope. But everywhere, time is winding up, in the words of one of our spirituals. In spite of years of national progress, the plight of the poor is worsening. Jobs are on the decline as a result of technological change. Schools, north and south, are proving themselves more and more inadequate to the task of providing adequate education and thereby entrance into the mainstream of society. Medical care is virtually out of reach for millions of black and white poor. In Mississippi, children are actually starving, while large landowners have placed their land in the soil bank and receive millions of dollars annually not to plant food and cotton. No provision is made for the lives and survival of the hundreds of thousands of sharecroppers who now have no work and no food. White America has allowed itself to be indifferent to race, prejudice, and economic denial. Thus, reasons for social hope and causes of personal despair are closely bound together in King's analysis because both are tied to a shared American dream, as expressed in the U.S. Constitution's language of individual rights and collective responsibilities for assuring both qualitative and quantitative aspects of the pursuit of happiness. Quote, "The American people are infected with racism. That is the peril. Paradoxically, they're also infected with democratic ideals. That is the hope. While doing wrong, they have the potential to do right. Nor have they a choice of continuing in the old way. The future they are asked to inaugurate is not so unpalatable that it justifies the evils that beset the nation. To end poverty, to extirpate prejudice, to free a tormented conscience, to make a tomorrow of justice, fair play, and creativity. All these are worthy of the American ideal." End quote. To make the reasonableness and desirability of this interpretation of the American ideal effective in motivating Americans to act in ways that would lead to achieving it, King believed a two-pronged communicative strategy was necessary. First, employing evidence and argument in essays and speeches designed to remove intellectual obstacles and to advance its acceptability. And second, creating vivid, expressively authentic, performative demonstrations of its moral importance through widely mass media transmitted and thus vicariously shared nonviolent communicative actions that would engage people's attention and emotions in ways that would promote conscience-guided reflection, ethical choice, and real commitment to a process of substantive change. In arguing for his case for the dimensions and preconditions of the positive peace he sought, King was very clear that ending segregation was not enough. Are you doing okay, by the way? Mm-hmm. All right. Shall I carry on? Okay. A just and democratic social and economic integration must be achieved in America for its own sake and so that this nation can serve as a model and a resource to other peoples and nations in their struggles to end interlocking forms of oppression and to achieve better lives. Real integration in King's sense required and still requires greater change than ending de jure racial segregation. De facto or customary segregation was and still is widespread. And it's not just what our customs are, it's where we live, who we encounter coming and going in our daily lives. We're segregated still in all those ways. And this too must be overcome by law, by economic and cultural change, and by personal choices if we are to achieve sufficient multidimensional social integration to motivate and facilitate further institutional changes toward a deep, fully integrated social democracy. Quote, "We must always be aware of the fact that our ultimate goal is integration, and that desegregation is only a first step on the road to the good society. Perhaps this is the point at which we should define our terms. The word segregation represents a system that is prohibitive. It denies the Negro equal access to schools, parks, restaurants, libraries, and the like. Desegregation is eliminative and negative, for it simply removes these legal and social prohibitions. Integration is creative and is therefore more profound and far-reaching than desegregation. Integration is the positive acceptance of desegregation and the welcomed participation of Negroes into the total range of human activities. Integration is genuine intergroup, interpersonal doing. Sounds like Dewey. Doing. Desegregation, then, rightly, is only a short-term goal. Integration is the ultimate goal of our national community. Thus, as America pursues the important task of respecting the letter of the law, that is, compliance with desegregation decisions, she must be equally concerned with the spirit of the law, that is, commitment to the democratic ideal of integration. Segregation cuts off the full freedom of the whole person, one's capacity to deliberate, decide, and respond within the limits of our destined nature, in King's words, because it sets arbitrary socioeconomic restraints on deliberation. Quote, "The absence of freedom is the imposition of restraint on my deliberation as to what I shall do, where I shall live, how much I shall learn, the kinds of tasks I shall pursue. I am robbed of the basic quality of humanness. When I cannot choose what I shall do or where I shall live or how I shall survive, it means in fact that someone or some system has already made these a priori decisions for me, and I am reduced to an animal. I do not live, I merely exist. The only resemblances I have to real life are the motor responses and functions that are akin to humankind. I cannot adequately assume responsibility as a person because I have been made a party to a decision in which I played no part in making." End quote. The socioeconomic system of segregation robs those it oppresses of a part of their freedom. Quote, "The very nature of his life is altered and his being cannot be made the full circle of personhood because that which is basic to the character of life itself has been diminished." End quote. Therefore, the process of struggle toward full democratic integration must not only end the legal and customary limits of de jure and de facto segregation and heal the psychic wounds caused by such arbitrary restrictions. Can you see where Cornel West picks up that language, the psychic wounds caused by such arbitrary restrictions? It must also stimulate a new quality of experience that, quotes, "unchains the spirit and the mind and provides for the highest degree of life quality freedom. I may do well in a desegregated society, but I can never know what my total capacity is until I live in an integrated society. I cannot be free until I have had the opportunity to fulfill my total capacity, untrammeled by any artificial hindrance or barrier." End quote. Thus, instead of being a call for utopian conditions of unlimited freedom for all, King's call for integration is a call for equal freedom from artificial and arbitrary limits. It is a call for democratic participation in determining what kinds of limits on all must be set by real shortages and rival priorities. And beyond current law, it is a call for each person voluntarily to deliberate, decide, and respond with equal respect for self and diverse others in determining where those limits must fall and how to live creatively within them. At the same time, it is a call for positive freedom understood in terms of developed capabilities, actual opportunities, and sufficient, equitable, and comparable resources to allow all citizens and other committed residents of the American nation to function as social equals, and co-participants in shaping a common future. Using a term that William James coined, King argued that personal experience of the discipline and the fruits of nonviolence mutually benefit all parties in a struggle toward integration, because such experiences are double-barreled, reflecting the value of human personality in two ways. Quote, nonviolence helps the individuals to adhere to proper means and proper goals. The nonviolent technique is double-barreled. Not only has the Negro developed a new image of himself employing its practices, but it has also thwarted the growth of bitterness. In a very large measure, nonviolence has helped to diminish long repressed feelings of anger and frustration. In the course of respecting the discipline of the nonviolent way, the Negro has learned that he must respect the adversary who inflicts the system upon him, and he develops the capacity to hate segregation, but to love the segregationist. He learns in the midst of his determined efforts to destroy the system that has shackled him so long that a commitment to nonviolence demands that he respect the personhood of his opponent. Thus, nonviolence exalts the personality of the segregator as well as the segregated. The common denominator of the flux of social change is the growing awareness on the part of the respective opponents that mutually they confront the eternality of the basic worth of every member of the human family, end quote. Thus, through a social mirroring process that begins with currently oppressed people's nonviolent performative demonstrations of self-respect, respect for their opponents, and determination to achieve the conditions of full freedom for all, even those who oppose integration learn what it is to be treated as a person of equal, infinite worth, and as a fellow citizen participant in democratic deliberations about a shared social future. At various points in his ongoing struggle to delineate feasible and desirable means of achieving the quantitative aspects of such a just and democratic integration in the American aftermath of chattel slavery and subsequent Jim Crow legal segregation and legally tolerated inequality in public accommodations, education, housing, wages, and employment opportunities, King suggested some particular economic strategies to be undertaken and some broad goals to be achieved that may stimulate our thinking today about how to break out of the racialized social system Professor Stickers analyzed as trapping us all. These include, first, demands for increased employment opportunities in desirable fields in which these were currently denied, to be offered on a preferential or targeted basis until the number of African Americans in that field came to equal the proportion of African Americans in the local population. In light of the social impasse over what we now call affirmative action that has emerged in recent years since King suggested it, and also in light of real data that show that poverty is a life-limiting trap that catches people of all races. The influential American sociologist William Julius Wilson has suggested reframing King's idea in terms of affirmative opportunities triggered by economic exclusion rather than race alone. Second, King offered calls to develop a national context-specific transformative economic framework that learns from Nehru's middle course between westernization and India's traditional economic institutions and practices. Nehru's strategy aimed to advance India's post-colonial economy by encouraging some controlled industrialization, while also encouraging the expansion of locally based handicrafts like spinning and weaving, as well as assisting a movement for consent-based land reform known as Bhutan, to actualize the ideal of self-sufficiency by persuading large landowners to give up some of their holdings to landless peasants, persuading small landowners to join together into village-controlled cooperatives, and encouraging rural people to spin and weave the fabric to make their own clothes, which would then allow bartering with other villages to get anything else they might need. You notice these diverse strategies going on here together. King commented that Nehru's combination of controlled and targeted industrialization with what we now call micro-enterprises had been remarkably successful at that point, representing a potential boon to democracy, but that the Indian government needed capital and technical know-how that the US and the West should provide as free gifts, and that the Bhutan movement needed more organization and drive in order to expand and sustain its achievements. Similar context-specific combinations of targeted industrial policies, stimulus for the formation of cooperatives, and practical training and funding for micro-enterprises may be effective in many parts of the world today, especially if the economically most powerful nations begin at the same time to hold large transnational corporations accountable for operating within a preferable set of financial, environmental, safety, and compensation constraints and minimums. The challenges of post-colonial land and asset redistribution the Bhutan movement aimed to achieve remains very difficult 50 years later. But various experiments in South and Central Africa, Eastern Europe, Asia, and Latin America suggest that a combination of nonviolent persuasion and incentives work better in the long run than violent land seizures and relocations. The third strategy King called for, reform of the structures of racist imperialism from within, so as to turn the technology and wealth of the West to the task of liberating the world from want, is still a crucial goal, and still a tough sell to those who hold vastly disproportionate economic and social powers. Changing consciousness on these issues of economic property rights emerged as the primary goal and achievement of the Occupy movement. But clearly, more must be done. Creating opportunities for college students to serve and learn from poor communities in other nations, such as the Global Outreach Program, can deepen that change of consciousness and may stimulate new experiments in sharing technologies and other transformative resources in mutually acceptable and liberating ways. When a significant number of educated Americans have learned why and how to work with others for their mutual benefit, as Jane Addams advised, we will have a workforce for change within the American nation. We still need King's fourth suggestion, an economic Bill of Rights that would remedy the lack of American constitutional guarantees of these basic human rights, including at a cost King estimated in 1966 as about $10 or $12 billion, guaranteeing a job to all adult Americans capable of working, in part by creating public service jobs as needed, as well as a guaranteed minimum annual income, more low-income housing, and a much larger government investment in education, the best quality education that can be given, in King's words, to assure to all individuals and families a quality of life markedly better than poverty. Fifth, King called for acceptance of black workers into greater numbers of union jobs. This is still a good goal, even though unions have taken a terrible beating since King's death. We must both revive and reorient labor unions in conversation with developing a balanced and targeted national industrial policy, supporting cooperatives and micro-enterprises, and creating effective international requirements and constraints on the business practices of large transnational firms. It seems to me these things need to happen together. Otherwise, simply reviving union organization won't work in the way King might have hoped. 6, King called for stimulating the creation of worker-owned cooperatives in both rural and urban areas that would multiply their members' economic power, shared knowledge, spread risk, and generate mutual support. Professor Stickers is working on this idea and can say more than I can about how to do it well. 7, King called for redistributing wealth, resources, and opportunities through tax policies that would not aim to compensate for past oppression. but rather to fund the educational initiatives, jobs programs, small business loans, and a minimum annual income that would equalize opportunities for all Americans in the present and the future, thereby creating the economic preconditions for full social democracy. And finally, 8, King called for a revolution of values, leading to widespread support for changes in economic models, institutions, and policies toward new ones that are neither capitalist nor communist, but rather situation-specific, adaptable models that are feasible and desirable in creating and sustaining, quote, a socially conscious democracy which reconciles the truth of individualism and collectivism, end quote. This is what I mean by a pragmatist political economy. In order for such a revolution of values to occur, rather than a gradual and imperceptible evolution in attitudes and associated public policies that would exceed the bounds of time and patience of the oppressed, something must happen to stimulate a dramatic process of personal and social reflection, reframing, revaluing, and recommitment. This was what King hoped the civil rights movement would be able to do with its focus on the internal logic of the shared American dream of justice and equality, even though he recognized that the nation's attention had shifted to war, which operates according to a different logic of rival interests, perceived necessity, patriotism, power, loss, and revenge. I have a discussion of his amazing speech at Riverside Church, A Time to Break Silence. But I'm going to skip over that part so that we'll still have time to talk when I stop talking. As we can see, King critiqued and fought to change the same racialized American social system on which Kenneth Stickers focused in his recent SAP presidential address. And he agreed that no one can opt out of that system simply by forming the right intentions. The only way to end benefiting from that system in ways Professor Stickers calls racist is to change the system, just as this is the only way to end one's exposure to harm from it. You can't buy your way out of a racial system. King regarded acceptance of social and economic injustice toward oneself and one's people as incompatible with self-respect. And he regarded both violence and toleration of injustice to others as incompatible with the dream of social democracy, a better quality of life that has motivated people to accept present suffering in the struggle to build a future civilization that actualizes these values. King regarded nonviolent protest and active advocacy for justice as the only way to attain the kind of positive peace that stable conditions of social and economic justice for all require. He valued reasonable argument, therefore he gave good reasons for what just treatment actually requires, and he suggested practical ways of achieving it. At the same time, King recognized that emotions motivate action and engage people's conscience. Therefore, he also worked to engage the emotions both of opponents and of those who are not thinking at all, through performative communicative actions with a dramatic character that aims to give justice a priority among their values and that motivates them to reflect and act toward doing what justice requires in the current situation. If people are to be motivated to undertake a lifelong struggle toward justice, they must believe that it is at least a cosmic possibility, whether through religious faith or through the examples of others. By his own example, King persuaded many that those who voluntarily suffer in the struggle for justice create new possibilities in the world while experiencing self-respect, expressing respect for others, and catching joyful glimpses of the better future for which they strive. If they are well organized and their communicative actions actually touch others, change may begin. However, fulfilling America's potential to become a fully actualized social democracy, King's beloved community in both qualitative and quantitative aspects, does not occur by changing hearts and minds alone, just as embracing the goal of integration is not the same as achieving it. This requires real power. Or rather, access to a cluster of powers that currently are held disproportionately by a few and used toward their own ends, both directly and by manipulating the fears and aspirations to dominance of many others. As King argued in a famous sermon called The Drum Major Instinct, another one I would urge you to read, although you really don't want me to quote from it right now. It may be very difficult to persuade those who hold the greatest clusters of powers to share them. King quoted Douglas in noting that the powerful never surrender anything without a struggle. But it may be possible to influence those of us who are less powerful to seek the good life as guided by more worthy ideals than consuming luxury goods and savoring others' envy. In pursuit of those better ends, to collaborate nonviolently with others to rebalance the power equation towards social democracy, economic justice, and positive peace. King called upon churches, schools, artists, government leaders, and public figures to play their proper roles in motivating people to redefine the good life in terms of justice and service. This too will be an interpretive struggle, he warned, and those who seek meaning in this way may also be misled. Remember, King noted, that the right means may be used in pursuit of the wrong ends, even with the best of intentions. And those who seek to become like him, a drum major for justice, may end up marching for something else entirely, as did many who rallied at the Lincoln Memorial a few years ago for Glenn Beck's colorblind vision of limited democracy and market-based justice. In light of these hopes and these worries, what change strategies do King's critical analysis and positive transformative proposal suggest for us in our current American and global problem situation of a growing race and colonialism-linked poverty gap within and between nations, widespread joblessness that threatens the middle class as well as the working class with losing their home, millions displaced worldwide by economic globalization as well as natural disasters, growing distrust of government, continuing wars, and ongoing threats of terrorism? Perhaps the following two ideas are good places to start. So here are my ideas. Organizing a new March on Washington for economic rights, to be sponsored by universities, churches, labor unions, small business organizations, artists, social leaders, and civic groups, and focusing on new job creation, including jobs focusing on long-term infrastructure rebuilding and urban renewal, legal basic protection of basic housing rights, including mortgages as well as leases, access to credit for small businesses and cooperatives, and a more equitable system of government funding for education to replace our current radically unequal system of relying almost entirely on widely varying local property tax revenues. This is the performative demonstrative act that I think might get us up and going and help us see who's out there and maybe get some more people thinking about stuff. We now have, of course, the internet and all kinds of blogs and all YouTube and the rest of it, in addition to the resources King had. I think this could be fun, and I think we could actually do it. So this is part of why I think we should do this. It gives some specificity to Occupy's critique, saying this is the transformative proposal. So that's the first one. And secondly, developing a new pragmatist paradigm of political economy that rejects the libertarian and objectivist philosophical commitments that led Alan Greenspan, America's once infallible economic guru, to reject financial regulation as unnecessary and intrusive on the ethical business leadership of CEOs and on the discipline of self-correcting markets. I was wrong, confessed Greenspan. The many economists, self-styled conservatives, and Tea Party members still still disagree. Replacing this disaster-producing and inequality-worsening model with a more humble vision of economics as a means to social democracy is what I advocate. One that acknowledges and fosters social cooperation as real and important, that documents human costs and benefits of various kinds of public and private productive efforts, and that generates feasible and desirable models of how we can meet quantitative as well as qualitative aspects of human rights at local, national, and global levels. As King suggested, we cannot compensate those who already have suffered incalculable injustices in America's racialized social system. But we can work to change it, to guide our transformative efforts, to help us interpret what we learned from them, and to remind us of why these efforts matter so much for all of us. We need a better theory to which philosophers can make valuable contributions. If we do our homework, pay attention, learn the languages of some other disciplines, and get out of the university often enough to build some solidarities that let us listen to what those who feel the tight shoes pinch tell us about where they need relief. Thank you for listening. Well, that's a very good question. Did everyone hear it? I mean, here's what I understood from your question. In one sense, we are in a post-colonial world situation. In another, clearly not. Colonialism takes on new forms. So, we don't have so many nation states invading other people's land, although Crimea is an interesting example recently in the news. You know, people still have tanks and soldiers they can send in and then ratify with a plebiscite by whoever remains after such an action. But the main forms of colonialism are not those that were practiced by Britain and France and Germany and Holland and America and Portugal and many other nations. In that period of taking over the cultures and the economies as well as the politics of other nations. Instead, we have a new form of colonialism now, or maybe it has multiple forms. Interestingly enough, a great American pragmatist philosopher, Alain Locke, wrote about this situation in the years during which World War I was being fought. So in his analysis, this new form of colonialism is economic, primarily. And its purpose is not so much to get people to change their religion, they can do whatever they like on that, as long as the consumer goods for which they aspire are those that are being produced to the benefit of the economic colonializer. The complicated aspect of this situation is that some of these colonial powers are located in, and in some ways representative of, particular nations. I remember my first French lesson when I was 18 years old at Michigan State University was on la coca-colonisation de la France. Isn't that fun? Where folks were already worried then, la coca-colonisation. Can you translate that? It's a little play on words. Coca-Cola, coca-colonization of France. So this whole idea of French people wanting to drink Coca-Cola and wear Levi's jeans and eat McDonald's hamburgers or whatever involves a fundamental displacement of French culture, which is the heart of what it is to be a nation. It's not so much the sort of political rights in this way of thinking about things, although those are important. Culture comes first. So then there's the idea, these multinational firms in particular are the agents and the powers that do the economic colonization now, sometimes with the aid and comfort of their nations, sometimes in active opposition to the laws of their own place, moving monies around and evading responsibility in their home base. This is part of why I think it's so important to focus international attention on reining in that process right now. At the same time, of course, it's very, very difficult. So many nations that have emerged from colonial status for periods, think for instance Central and Eastern Europe, you know, which were in a sort of colonial relationship with the Soviet Union as it was at that time and for many years, emerged into a situation economically in which they were client states and really don't have the power to initiate and control the terms of negotiation, but instead have to be price takers instead of price makers. But you know, some countries have been very clever, and we can learn from their example, I think. So Poland, for instance, resisted the efforts of the International Monetary Fund. It was the IMF, even more than the World Bank, which was trying to get them to liberalize their terms of property rights in ways they said, you know what, we're just not going to do, and we'll accept the consequences. So instead of making it easy for people from other places to acquire land and other property rights in Poland, they said, nope, we're going to control our economic openings somewhat here in order to maintain political sovereignty, and also to keep open opportunities for people from our own culture who have lived through such a terrible time and who are fully capable of making good use of these opportunities. Well, they're one of the most successful economies in Europe right now. Germany and Poland go back and forth between, you know, who's in the best shape. So it shows you that sometimes in certain contexts it can work to push back. But at the same time, if we as an American people are going to take seriously this ideal of social democracy I've been talking about, it's pretty clear we cannot achieve it for ourselves, let alone assure it for anyone else, unless we work internationally with others who have real coercive powers and who are the ones who control the law that frames the existence and the operation of any corporate business entity to restrict the choices that people make in ways that are less coercive on peoples in various parts of the world. It's funny to talk about nations because so many of those boundaries were drawn in such an arbitrary fashion without any sort of involvement with local peoples in determining them, no real citizen participation. But I just want to talk about the liberty of peoples even more than the liberty of nations in that regard. It's a partial response. You may raise a very important point. Thanks. Who else wants to say something? Yes, ma'am. Speak right up.
I am a bit lost. Could you please explain to me what this entire, your paper was on drawing insight from Martin Luther King's philosophies to, in a way, modify the economy so that there will be no more racial difference? Is it more on race or economy?
The two cannot be separated. That's why it's confusing. So in this, King's views are very close to those of many people, but two prominent African-American feminist thinkers, Kimberly Crenshaw and Patricia Hill Collins, when they talk about intersectionality. So their idea is that we can't make sense of the idea of race, let alone say who is what race, or how race works in the world, separately from questions about class and economic power in that whole domain, as well as gender, and maybe some other factors. We probably have to include sexuality, we have to include religion, you know, there are other aspects of this. So if we're going to talk about who Martin Luther King Jr. was, for instance, well, one piece of what he was an African American. But you can't say African American is just a race. That's also a culture, a history, a legal status. And at the same time, this is a man from a middle-class background, even though the South in the United States at that time had a kind of caste system. So, you know, middle-class white was a separate system from middle-class black. And at the same time, his family had certain economic, educational, social powers, certain kinds of practical know-how, certain kinds of safety from harm that had to do with having a network of people, black as well as white, who would stand up for them. Among other things, he was also a heterosexual Christian married man who at the same time in the discussion of religion in my paper did not offer, what would you say, ontological analyses of the God in which he believed, but instead had a sense of the divine as providence and presence with us, who speaks to us in a language that cannot be coded in English. There is no set of proper names that effectively refer to this one. And so, you know, all of this is part of what he is. So to talk about his race can't be separated from his class, which can't be separated from his cultural stream, which can't be separated from his gender, which can't be separated from his sexual orientation, which can't be separated from his religious heritage and his particular way of, you see what I'm saying? All of this goes together. So, I mean, I think that's part of what thinking with King now requires us to take account of. Yes, ma'am?
So the selling point of King's pragmatist political economy is the fact that when the segregation or any kind of discrimination against any part of, like what you just said, if there's no segregation against him because of his religion or his color, it will benefit both the segregationer and the person on the receiving end and the person on the giving end. That's the basic point of it.
Yes. So this is an older idea than King's. Angela Davis, I understand, spoke here recently, and in those famous lectures that she gave at UCLA in the late 1960s, she drew on Hegel to talk about the master-slave dialectic. And I think this idea is helpful in understanding King, and it's helpful in understanding our current situation. So the way Hegel talked about the master-slave dialectic is that both the one who would oppress and the one who is oppressed are unfree. They're locked together in this mess. And it's not just that you have to worry about whether you're safe at night because of what you did to somebody that day. It's also because that way of treating other people in whom your own humanity is mirrored lessens your own sense of who and what you are, at least potentially. You are damaged by damaging other people. And so when you stop that mess, when you learn how to see the other person as a human being, as Malcolm X reported doing when he was on his Hajj, when he was in Mecca and told about, he tells this story in autobiography, right, of Malcolm X. The experience of seeing a white man with blonde hair and blue eyes and feeling and calling him brother sincerely. That was a moment of irreversible, historic joy and transformation, as he reports it. So the deal would be then that as long as people are caught up in the master-slave dialectic, as long as people are involved in the daily processes of being oppressed or oppressors, Neither is free. And the only way to let everybody experience that ability to live freely, to dream creative dreams, to plan a life, to look to one another as sources of help rather than as threats, is to just give up this whole system. Giving up the whole system is harder than it looks like. I think that's Sticker's point, because as long as we live separately and in ways that are not equal, and as long as our churches involve, the places where we go, our churches, I would hope, are the places we go to be as free as it's possible to be, where we can lay down our burdens, where we can weep. Any church I can't weep in is no church I'm going to, where I say, I've had a hell of a week. I'm just sort of letting it go. And then at the same time saying, I feel free to begin again. Okay, now, if I'm doing that only with people who look like me, while around the corner or across town, there are the people who don't look like me, who are experiencing a really different quality of life than I am, because, in part, my life is premised on various kinds of privileges that maybe I don't want to see, that maybe I want to say, well, either my parents paid for that, or I worked hard for that, or it was my God-given gifts that got me that opportunity. Well, that kind of freedom is short-lived at best if we experience it in those churches, because we run up against other human beings the next day who actually don't have those privileges, whose moms and dads weren't in a position to pay for that, who work equally hard, maybe harder than I do. Judith Mary Green needs a lot of playtime, let me just tell you that. Probably work harder than I do, and at the same time who are every bit as gifted as I am.
But don't have the same opportunity because they're not of the same race.
So how am I going to sustain my feeling of freedom? A feeling that my life is graced by God's gift, rather than by an unequal racialized social system.
Do you know Sister Antonia Ebo?
I know that name. Where is she?
Up in St. Louis.
Uh-huh. Oh, there you go. All right.
On the 12th of April, she'll be having her 90th birthday. And for some reason, she exhausted the A-list and asked me off the B-list to preach at her celebration.
Well.
She was raised part-time. This is her 90th birthday. She was raised part of her early life in an orphanage. She joined the Franciscan Sisters of Mary, and along with 3 other black women who were kept in their own cottage and had their own separate table in the convent. She got her nursing training and worked at a segregated Catholic hospital.
This is my church as well as your church
And
we're talking about.
And this nun decided that she was going to march with Martin Luther King on the march from Selma to Montgomery. And the women of God that she supposedly lived with told her, if you get on that plane and go down there, you will not be a member of our religious community when you come back. And she said, okay, and got on the plane. So anyone who's ever seen the public television documentary, The Sisters of Selma, of course they're selling it the best way they can, because there's Sister Antonia Ebo's beautiful face in full habit, center in the picture. And she's still Sister Antonia Ebo in that same community, 90 years old, and every Sunday, St. Alphonsus Church in St. Louis prays for her health and well-being, and they're throwing a huge birthday party for her because she performed and demonstrated how we can live in the not yet as an example of how we can all march together. So I just say, Sister Antonia and you need to talk to each other sometime.
I want to meet this woman.
She's up there saying, and as a part of that whole history, She still has her own apartment. She doesn't live in the convent with those women, but they do have to pay for it. So I just think.
Isn't that fun? I just love these little ironies,
Yeah, I
you know?
So,
I just
but
love it.
You two need to know each other. She's in St. Louis and she's easy to find.
I love it.
Everybody knows her.
I love it. Well, please give her my greetings in advance
I
and
will.
tell her.
No, I will, because I'm going to talk about you.
This tall white woman with a PhD who lives in a multicultural community will be ringing her doorbell with a sense that infinity and eternity are our sorority.
Thank you.
One quick thought.
Hey, quick one and then add. Okay, ready, Rig? Okay.
Yeah, I was just curious if you had any suggestions or thoughts on how to push forward the process of integration while avoiding the pitfalls of what I might call crass assimilation.
Well, that is a big and important question. What do you want to say?
Yeah, so the reason why more practices don't make things that it's nonviolent. What are they afraid of? If nonviolence really is more effective in problem solving or amelioration.
Well, I'm just going to say they're ignorant. They haven't heard about it yet. So we have some work to do. Now, everyone who heard all these passages from King today and has some idea where to get them is now in a position to preach, you understand. And I think that's an important part of what we need to do. But the other thing we need to do, my friend, is simply show up. This is the personal choice part of things. Okay, you work for institutional change. You ask for reform of all kinds. You start up various projects, but you also just show up. I've been singing in this interfaith gospel choir in Mount Vernon, New York, a minority-majority community, which was our first home after we showed up, and Fordham University Stickers has been there. Joe Smith has lived there. And, you know, that choir has been a great blessing to me. Not only did I learn some amazing music and, you know, hang out with phenomenal human beings, but, I mean, I have friends that I otherwise would never have known. Our paths wouldn't have crossed. And sometimes I can help out in some ways. You know, it's not so much with the $20 here or there. It's sometimes with, well, this is how you get into a university. It's sometimes with, you know, I know somebody who's looking to hire somebody in this slot where somebody's son or cousin or that person herself may very well need a job. And sometimes somebody asks me to pray for them, which is humbling because, of course, Catholic women aren't supposed to say anything much. You know that.
I was raised by them. I don't know that.
Yeah, exactly. But in any case, so, you know, I stand up and I turn out not to be the whore of Babylon, which is what, of course, some folks, if they're really coming from a particular fundamentalist background, think all Catholics are. But I can stand there and represent and receive the blessings thereof. Now, how did I get all of that richness? How did I become such a rich woman? I showed up. So what you need to do is to figure out where are some people you need to know from which you can learn something and who might be able to benefit by something or other you already know how to do, and you know how to do incredibly much because you are a privileged human being, you know. Well, you know how to do a lot. So just find a place, listen around, ask around, and show up. And don't be discouraged originally if people give you the beady eye and say, he's not going to stay. Or suggest, what kind of odd views do you suppose he holds? What does he eat for breakfast? Because, of course, they don't know anything about you either because we're in this segregated society. So you just have to show up, keep showing up. And eventually you will have friends. You will have a beloved community. And that will be the seed for you of imagination and of program development that will have further implications, because after all, none of us are ultimately separate individuals. We are in this together. And we privileged denizens of the university are here not just for our own wonderful sake, but because so we might do somebody some good in the world. So I would recommend this program of action to you as not only your greatest opportunity, but but the responsibility of education in a civilized society in a world that's desperately in need of just the kind of help you can provide. Amen. Thank you. Thank you.
And they sang that song at his funeral. It helped somebody.